it's really interesting to come back to an early book when you've now had sort of a dozen years of further research and articulation of a project. And so in a lot of ways I became my own reader. And now I was reading The Fall of Interpretation, having written Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Desiring the Kingdom most significantly, and just having completed the next volume in the Cultural Liturgies project, which is called Imagining the Kingdom. And I see this real continuity of development there that would, and I'd tie the thread together this way, I think. The argument of The Fall of Interpretation has always emphasized that we interpret the world, that we construe the world. That's how we understand it, that's how we make sense of it. And that interpretation and construal of the world is always based on kind of background assumptions and conditions that we bring to our perception of the world. We always see the world as something, and we see it as something on the basis of horizons of perception that we bring to it. This is kind of the core of the argument developing from phenomenology and philosophical hermeneutics. Well, I would say then, what happens in my later work, especially in Imagining the Kingdom and Desiring the Kingdom, is I really emphasize that those horizons, those conditions, those presuppositions that shape our construal of the world are the products of liturgical formation. That you acquire horizons of perception through your immersion in communities of practice that kind of make a background story seep into your bones. It becomes part of your cognitive unconscious. And now that's what becomes the frame, the paradigm, the lens through which now you make sense of your world. And I think in The Fall of Interpretation I hadn't yet seen the importance of practice, tradition. I mean, tradition is there, and now I would say the later work unpacks that the way you become part of a tradition is by being immersed in a community of practice. And in particular, I tend to talk about that in terms of liturgies. Now, I also think this helps to make sense of how what I call secular liturgies work, which is secular liturgies now are other communities of practice that actually are shaping our horizons. They're shaping our background perception. They are other stories that covertly seep into us. And now those will affect how we see the world. They'll affect how we construe our world in front of us. So it's interesting. I think the role of liturgies and practices is a hermeneutical one. I think it shapes how we construe and understand and interpret our world, which is why then we need to be much more intentional about what communities of practice that we are immersed in. So I hope readers will find this kind of golden thread that ties together this project, and in a way the later books are kind of expanding and unpacking, but now the second edition of The Fall of Interpretation is sort of the stance that pulls that all back together so that you can see it as one project and one voice, even though I would have never anticipated that's where it was going when I first wrote The Fall of Interpretation. So it's kind of fun to see how one is led theoretically and theologically down pathways, and only retrospectively can you look back and see this sort of almost like there was a plan about it. So I'm grateful for that opportunity.